Who were the Watchers? Why does Mount Hermon echo through ancient fear? And why did one book preserve their story while many others set it aside? Tonight we step into one of the most unsettling traditions around early Jewish thought, the account of heavenly beings who crossed a boundary they were never meant to cross. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers are not symbols drifting in myth alone. They are presented as agents of rebellion, teachers of dangerous knowledge, and a turning point in humanity's moral collapse. Some details in later retellings are disputed, but the core warning remains strikingly consistent. But here's the thing. This is not just a tale about strange beings in a distant age. It is a mirror held up to power, desire, and knowledge without obedience. The thesis of this episode is simple. The story of the Watchers in Enoch frames evil not as chaos by accident, but as corruption that spreads when spiritual authority abandons its limits. And here is our path. We will trace the descent on Mount Hermon, examine the rise of the Nephilim and the violence linked to them, explore the forbidden arts said to be taught to humanity, and then confront why Enoch's account was excluded by many communities while still preserved in others. First comes the mountain. Hermon is remembered as the place of oath and dissent, where a group of watchers binds itself to a shared act of defiance. The narrative is deliberate. This is not a moment of weakness by one figure, but a collective decision. That matters, because collective rebellion carries collective consequences. If the tradition is read cautiously, the point is theological as much as historical. When beings entrusted with guardianship seek self-rule, creation suffers. Then the story turns to the Nephilim, often described as giants and linked to escalating bloodshed. Interpretations vary on what language is literal and what is apocalyptic imagery. Yet Enoch's moral logic is clear. Corruption multiplies. Violence becomes ordinary. The strong consume the weak. The text paints a world where disorder is no longer private sin, but a public ecosystem. And then comes the most haunting layer, forbidden arts taught to humanity. Occult practices, manipulative knowledge, and seductive distortions of beauty are listed as gifts that are not gifts at all, skills detached from wisdom. Here's what most people miss. The problem is not knowledge by itself, but knowledge severed from reverence, restraint, and accountability. In that sense, Enoch feels uncomfortably modern. So why was Enoch excluded? The short answer is not a single council with a single motive. Canon formation unfolded across centuries, with different Jewish and Christian communities weighing language, apostolic continuity, liturgical use, and doctrinal fit in different ways. Even so, echoes of Enoch survive in later writings, and one major Christian tradition, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, continued to preserve it in canon. Rejection, then, is only part of the story. Transmission is the other half. If this account unsettles you, it should. Scripture repeatedly warns that not every spiritual voice is trustworthy, and not every impressive revelation is holy. We are called to test what we hear, not merely admire what sounds powerful. Stay with me, because by the end we will ask the hardest question beneath all of this. Did the ancient world fear forbidden knowledge, or did it fear what we become when we crave power more than truth? What happens when guardians stop guarding and start grasping? What happens when authority tastes desire and calls it wisdom? The Book of Enoch places that tension on a mountain and lets history tremble under it. If the Watcher's story is only about strange beings, then it stays safely in the past. If it is a warning about power without obedience, then it moves uncomfortably close to us. The tradition begins with dissent, but not with innocence. The setting is Mount Hermon, remembered as a high place tied to oath, rebellion, and shared resolve. The text describes a group, not an isolated figure. Their act is collective, intentional, and bound by mutual promise. That detail changes everything. Private temptation can be repented quietly. Coordinated defiance can reshape a world. In Enoch 6, The watchers descend and bind themselves with an oath. Ancient interpreters have debated literal sequence, literary layering, and possible sources. Yet the narrative logic is stable. The higher the trust, the heavier the fall. They are presented as beings assigned to watch, and they choose instead to cross a line tied to desire and possession. Is this a cosmic scandal or a moral parable in narrative form? The text allows readers to ask both questions while refusing to reduce the event to harmless myth. Why Hermon? Some scholars point to geography and memory, a mountain near contested borders, a place where heaven and earth symbolically meet. Others note later associations in regional tradition and liturgical imagination. Whether every layer is original or added through transmission, Hermon functions like a witness stand. The mountain is where a vow of rebellion is spoken aloud, and once spoken, it cannot be unsaid. Notice the progression. The watchers do not begin by teaching weapons or charms. They begin by breaking order. First comes disordered authority, then disordered knowledge, then disordered society. This sequence supports the thesis that the story is not chasing spectacle for its own sake. It is mapping a pattern. Corruption is not random weather. It has a chain. Could the descent language be apocalyptic symbolism rather than reportage? Many careful readers think at least some of it is symbolic, but symbolic does not mean trivial. Symbolic language often carries precise moral architecture. A story can be non-literal in form and still literal in warning. Enoch presses one claim with relentless force. When beings trusted with boundaries erase those boundaries for appetite, everyone below pays the price. The names preserved in different manuscripts vary in spelling and order. Shemihaza and Asael are often highlighted in later discussion, but manuscript tradition is complex. We should hold the details with humility. Still, the portrait remains sharp. Leadership can normalize sin faster than law can contain it. If you have ever watched a respected voice reframe compromise as enlightenment, you already understand the heart of this scene. But here's the thing. Enoch does not frame evil as ignorance alone. It frames evil as unsubmitted intelligence. Brilliant beings become destructive because brilliance is no substitute for reverence. The rebellion is not merely erotic, political, or ritual, it is theological. The watchers act as if authority can exist without accountability to the one who gave it. And that is why the descent matters beyond curiosity. The point is not to turn ancient texts into a conspiracy board. The point is to recognize that moral collapse often begins where confidence is highest. The ones who should have protected become the ones who penetrate. The ones assigned to keep watch become the ones who open the gate. If this opening scene feels severe, it should. The narrative is preparing us for consequences that do not remain in the heavens. Once the oath is sealed on Hermon, the damage moves downward into flesh, cities, and blood. The next question is unavoidable. What kind of world grows when rebellion becomes culture? And that takes us directly into the rise of the Nephilim. When the story turns to the Nephilim, the atmosphere changes from violation to expansion. Now the damage has scale. Enoch 7 describes immense offspring, devouring resources, and escalating violence. Genesis 6 gives only a compressed glimpse, but Enoch stretches the scene to show social breakdown in slow motion. Is giant language literal height, symbolic tyranny, or both? Traditions differ, and scholars remain divided. The moral direction, however, is unmistakable. The strong consume the weak. Hunger becomes predatory. Force becomes normal. Boundaries that once protected life are mocked as barriers to appetite. This is why the Nephilim section is not just monster lore. It is a study in what happens when power is detached from order. The narrative pictures a world where domination is admired and mercy is treated as naivete. Think of the rhythm. First extraordinary strength appears, Then social fear consolidates around it. Then imitation spreads. Communities begin to mirror the violence they fear. At that point, corruption is no longer an elite phenomenon. It becomes atmospheric. Children inherit it. Markets absorb it. Speech starts sounding like it. You do not need every sentence of the tradition to be literal reportage to feel the precision of the diagnosis. Could ancient giant motifs draw from broader Near Eastern memory and epic imagery? That is very possible. The presence of similar motifs in neighboring literatures does not automatically discredit Enoch. It can also show how biblical communities reworked shared symbols to make a theological claim. In Enoch, giant power is not celebrated, it is indicted, and here the episode thesis tightens. Authority without submission leads to knowledge without reverence, and that leads to force without restraint. The Nephilim are not random creatures dropped into the text for atmosphere. They are the social body of corruption. They represent what rebellion looks like when it becomes public order. Some readers ask whether this section explains all evil as supernatural contamination. The text is more nuanced than that. Human accountability never disappears. In many Jewish and Christian readings, the Watchers intensify corruption, but humans still choose, participate, and perpetuate. Enoch does not erase moral agency. It heightens moral urgency. This is where modern ears should listen carefully. Every era creates its own giants, not always in size, often in systems. Giant appetites, giant economies of harm, giant voices that can shape desire faster than conscience can answer. The Nephilim image warns that once predation becomes aspirational, society begins calling violence realistic and holiness impractical. Does Enoch intend a direct timeline to the flood? Many interpreters read it that way. Others caution that textual development across centuries complicates strict chronology. Even with that caution, the flood motif in related traditions functions as moral verdict. Corruption has exceeded private limits and entered structural life. Judgment, then, is not arbitrary thunder. It is portrayed as response to a world where life itself is being consumed. In some manuscripts and later retellings, the language of cannibalism appears with severe intensity. We should mark transmission questions honestly, but the symbolic core remains clear enough. Predation has become identity. The image is meant to repel. It asks us whether we recognize a society when it no longer protects the vulnerable but feeds on them. Here is a contrast worth keeping. Fear can make communities crave stronger giants to defeat existing giants. Enoch offers a different warning. The answer to corrupt power cannot be more unaccountable power. If guardians became predators, then restoration must include restored limits, restored reverence, restored obedience. A brief pastoral note belongs here. Not every spiritual claim that sounds bold is trustworthy. Not every movement that promises strength can be called holy. Discernment is not cynicism. Discernment is love that refuses to flatter violence. By now, the tension should be sharper. We have seen rebellion become structure and structure become harm, but the story still has a deeper layer. Where did this new violence learn its language? The next movement says it was taught, practiced, and transmitted as skill. And that brings us to the forbidden arts. The most haunting claim in Enoch is not merely that boundaries were crossed. It is that transgression was packaged as instruction. Enoch 8 and related passages attribute specific teachings to watcher figures, including weapon craft, metalwork for war, cosmetic seduction, enchantments, astrology, and forms of hidden knowledge. Lists differ by manuscript stream and translation choices, so caution matters. Yet the pattern is coherent. Corruption becomes curriculum. Why does this matter so much? Because teaching is multiplication. One rebellious act can wound a generation. A rebellious pedagogy can wound centuries. The text imagines forbidden arts, not as random tricks, but as technologies of disordered desire, tools that magnify violence, practices that manipulate perception, methods that sever skill from wisdom. Here's what most people miss. The issue is not that all craft, beauty, or observation of the heavens is evil. The issue is orientation. In biblical imagination, knowledge is meant to be stewarded under reverence. In the Watcher's frame, knowledge is seized for domination, seduction, and control. Same human capacities, opposite moral direction. Consider the recurring pairing of weapons and cosmetics in the tradition. At first glance, it sounds strange, even arbitrary. But together, they suggest two fronts of corruption: external force and internal seduction, coercion and enchantment, the sword that compels and the image that manipulates. Both can be used lawfully in different contexts, yet in this narrative, both are represented as detached from covenant purpose. What about astrology and celestial signs? Ancient Jewish texts show a range of attitudes toward astronomical knowledge, calendar practice, and divination. Some traditions preserve careful celestial observation for liturgical order. Others condemn attempts to extract control over fate. Enoch seems to warn against knowledge of the heavens when used to bypass dependence on God and justify power plays. Could the list of forbidden arts reflect polemic against rival priestly or cultural groups? Possibly. Texts often arise in contested worlds, but even if polemical layers exist, the theological warning still stands. Knowledge can be true in technique and false in telos. A method can work while still deforming the soul, and that is painfully contemporary. Our age prizes capability. We ask what can be done long before asking what should be done. We reward scale before asking about virtue. We can map behavior, target attention, alter emotion, and automate persuasion. None of that is neutral once reverence is removed. Enoch is ancient, but its alarm sounds modern because the temptation is modern. At this point, someone will object. Is the text anti-knowledge? No, not in any simplistic sense. The wider scriptural tradition celebrates wisdom, craftsmanship, careful memory, and truthful testimony. The warning is against knowledge as self-enthronement, knowledge as leverage without accountability, knowledge as permission to treat people as material. This helps resolve a common misunderstanding. Forbidden knowledge in Enoch is not forbidden because curiosity is sinful. It is forbidden because the mode of acquisition and the mode of use are corrupt, seized without authorization, taught without covenant guardrails, applied without love of neighbor. And this returns us to the central dilemma of the episode. Is the Watcher's story mainly supernatural report or moral warning? The text keeps inviting both lenses, but it keeps pressing the second with greater urgency. Whether one reads the beings as literal rebels or as dramatized spiritual critique, the practical warning remains the same. Power detached from obedience will seek disciples. It will train them. Some claims in popular media about ancient technology, alien intervention, or hidden code in Enoch go far beyond responsible evidence. We should resist that inflation. The text is already severe without speculative overlays. Its own burden is heavy enough. Corruption can become transmissible through admired expertise. Charisma can normalize what conscience would otherwise reject. A short pastoral reflection here can keep the balance. Ask not only who is teaching, but what kind of person their teaching is forming. If a lesson increases pride, contempt, or appetite for domination, that lesson is not wisdom, no matter how impressive it sounds. So, where does this leave the book itself? If Enoch carries such a potent warning, why was it excluded in many communities while preserved in others? The answer is not a simple suppression plot, and the final movement requires historical patience. To understand the message, we must also understand the canon debate. When people hear that Enoch was not included in most Jewish and many Christian canons, they often imagine a single dramatic meeting where leaders erased dangerous truth. History is usually less cinematic. Canon formation unfolded over long periods across regions, languages, and liturgical practices. Different communities asked overlapping but not identical questions. Was a text read publicly in worship? Did it align with received doctrine? Was it linked to authoritative figures in a credible way? How stable were its manuscripts? How was it used pastorally? Enoch stands at an unusual crossroads. It was influential in Second Temple Judaism and appears to echo in parts of the New Testament world, especially in Jude 14-15 and thematic overlaps elsewhere. Early Christian writers show familiarity with it to varying degrees. Yet influence is not the same as canonicity. A text can be revered, cited, or mined for imagery without being installed as scriptural norm in every tradition. Language and transmission mattered too. Large portions of 1 Enoch survived in Ge'ez through Ethiopian tradition, while Aramaic fragments from Qumran confirmed earlier Jewish circulation. Greek and other pathways are partial and complicated. Communities making canon decisions often depended on what was textually available, liturgically integrated, and doctrinally trusted in their own stream. Does exclusion mean the book is worthless? Not at all. Many non-canonical works remain historically and theologically valuable for context. They illuminate interpretive worlds, anxieties, symbols, and debates that shaped the period around the Hebrew Bible and early Christianity. But a community can still decide that such a work does not function as final doctrinal rule. That distinction is crucial. And does preservation in Ethiopian Orthodoxy prove universal authority? It proves enduring authority within that canon and that tradition, which deserves respect. It does not automatically settle canonicity for all churches. The mature response is neither dismissal nor sensational promotion. It is careful reading with ecclesial honesty. Here, the main question sharpens one final time. If the Watcher's tradition is read only as forbidden archive material, we miss its ethical edge. If it is read only as moral metaphor, we may flatten historical claims too quickly. The wisest path may be disciplined tension, hold textual humility where evidence is debated, hold moral clarity where the warning is explicit. Good later doctrinal concerns about angelology, cosmology, and speculative interpretation have contributed to caution around Enoch in some communities, very likely. Leaders responsible for catechesis often resist texts that invite uncontrolled speculation. That concern can be protective, though it can also narrow imagination if handled poorly. Again, history is mixed, not monochrome. We should not pretend the canon process was pure politics or pure neutrality. It involved prayer, conflict, pastoral strategy, and human limitation. To admit that is not to discredit canon. It is to treat history as history. God works through communities that are faithful yet finite. And this is where the episode thesis lands with full weight. Enoch endures because it names a recurring human crisis. Authority can become appetite. Knowledge can become weapon. Culture can baptize domination as wisdom. The canon debate does not erase that warning. In some ways, it amplifies it by forcing us to ask how communities guard truth without feeding curiosity that destroys reverence. If you are wondering what to do with a text like this, begin with posture. Neither gullibility nor contempt. Read with scripture in hand, tradition in view, and conscience awake. Mark uncertainties honestly. Refuse theatrical certainty where evidence is thin. Refuse moral evasiveness where the warning is plain. One more pastoral line before we close this movement. We are not called to fear every mystery. We are called to test every spirit and every teaching by the fruit it bears. Does it produce humility, repentance, justice, and mercy, or does it produce fascination with power and permission to exploit? Now step back and see the whole arc. A descent on Hermon framed as deliberate rebellion, a generation of giants linked to social predation, a curriculum of forbidden arts that multiplies corruption, a contested canon history that reminds us transmission is complex but discernment is necessary. 4 movements, 1 thread. Moral collapse begins when authority abandons obedience. So the deepest danger in this episode is not ancient and distant. It is always near. It appears whenever gifted voices treat limits as obstacles, whenever technique outruns character, whenever communities admire results more than righteousness. The Watchers may belong to ancient literature, but the temptation they embody is present tense. And if that is true, then the final question is waiting for us at the threshold of the next chapter. If corrupted authority can train a world in violence, what does faithful authority look like when it rebuilds a world in truth? So where does this leave us after Hermon, the Nephilim, the forbidden arts, and the long canon debate around Enoch? We can close with 3 takeaways, and each one returns to the same spine. The Watcher's tradition may preserve memories of supernatural rebellion, or it may frame that rebellion through apocalyptic theology, and some historical layers remain debated. But in either reading, the warning lands with force. Moral collapse does not begin at the edge of society. It begins at the top, when authority refuses obedience. Second, the Nephilim and the violence linked to them are not just an ancient horror scene. Literal details are disputed across manuscripts and interpretations, yet the narrative pattern is unmistakable. Corruption scales. What begins as transgression among the powerful becomes suffering among the vulnerable. In Enoch's moral world, evil is not merely private appetite. It becomes structure, culture, and eventually normal life. Third, the forbidden teachings expose the deepest fracture. The issue is not knowledge itself, but knowledge detached from reverence, skill without restraint, influence without accountability. And when we ask why Enoch was excluded by many communities yet preserved by others, the answer is complex, historical, and uneven, not a single act of suppression. Canon was shaped over centuries by language, doctrine, liturgy, and pastoral caution. Rejection is part of the story, but transmission is part of it too. That means the central question is still alive. Are we reading a record of strange beings only, or a theological mirror that reveals what happens when spiritual authority craves power more than truth? This episode has argued for the mirror, not to erase mystery, but to keep mystery from distracting us from responsibility. A brief pastoral thought before we end. We do not honor God by fearing every hidden thing, and we do not honor Him by chasing every hidden thing. We honor Him by testing what we hear, weighing what it produces, and refusing to call darkness wisdom just because it sounds advanced. If this story unsettles you, hold on to that discomfort for a moment. It may be doing honest work, because the most dangerous corruption rarely arrives looking evil. It arrives sounding insightful, useful, and urgent. In the next episode, we follow the line from corrupted heavenly authority to divine judgment and ask a harder question. When judgment falls in these texts, is it destruction alone, or the first act of mercy for a world being devoured? If this deep dive helped you see Enoch with clearer eyes, subscribe for the next chapter. Based on what we uncovered together in today's episode, answer this in the comments. Do you think Enoch is warning about forbidden facts or corrupted spiritual authority? And as always, God bless you.